So, good afternoon, everybody. It's Giovanni Porcari speaking from Kepler HR. We're here today with David Cunningham, who's, of course, a good friend of mine. We met back in 2019, I think, in Stirling, Scotland. And today, David will help us understand how things are going in the UK as well. We know the 2020 pandemic has had huge effects on the economy and on the labor market as well. But we surely want to know some more details about another country, which is the UK and also Scotland, because David lives in Scotland, works in Scotland. He works at the Forth Valley Chamber of Commerce, if I'm not wrong, and at the Stirling University Innovation Park, which is also the place where we met almost 2 years ago. So first of all, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. I'm very glad that you're here on Kepler HR. So how are things going in the UK? How is the 2020 pandemic affecting the economy? If you want to spend a couple of words, you told me you should have some figures and numbers. You should help us understand how things going. So that's it. My first question should be is how are things going and in the UK?
Perfect. Thank you, Giovanni. I think it's fair to say the effect has been disastrous, to put it mildly. And I think the reason we've seen such an effect is because the UK is primarily a service-based economy. When we look at figures from last year, when we went into our initial lockdown in March of around 2020, the UK saw a contraction in its GDP of around 19%, which, that's almost a fifth of our GDP wiped out. And that was just from the first lockdown. And the figures have only really continued to rise since then. I think as well, as far as the labour market, when we look at that, unemployment in Scotland specifically is raised by around 18,000 people. 6,000 of that has been from youth unemployment. But the government has been enacting schemes to combat these, such as a furlough scheme, a variety of loan schemes, including the CBILS or Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, and other bursaries and grants available through local councils. So the government has been taking efforts to combat this, but I think it is fair to say it has been relatively dire for the UK, given how our economy operates.
So unemployment is obviously, especially from the point of view of the job market, so of the labour market and labour economics, one of the most important effects the 2020 pandemic has had on the economy. So on this topic, so on the topic of labour market, of job market, what kind of changes have you noticed in the UK? Just a word on the Italian labour market. Italian workers cannot be fired at the moment. This is a strong measure the government has taken, as approved, but in a couple of months we expect. So when the block will be over, we expect almost 1 million workers to be fired. So it's going to be trouble. But in the UK, what kind of changes have you noticed in the labour market?
So overall, again, it's been pretty dire, right? It's not been ideal. I think we've seen, and I'm sure Italy and much of Europe will be the same, different industries have been affected a lot harder than others, For example, one of the hardest hit in the UK is the tourism and hospitality industry. Just by the very nature of those industries, they require close contact with people, and they are just the most susceptible to the situation we find ourselves in, like a global pandemic, Kind of anecdotal evidence here, but for example, supermarkets have been relatively stable throughout most of the pandemic. They're obviously a necessity. It's how the majority of Britain gets like their basic necessities and groceries and such like. So they've regarding employment for supermarkets, for example, they've seen quite a rise. A lot of temporary staff have been picked up to kind of pick up the pace and ensure smooth operations there. Other industries, like I'd mentioned, hospitality, have been hit a lot harder. But I think something that's kind of lessened the impact, although not completely removed the impact, but lessened the impact of the virus, is remote working. A lot of industries have been able to operate online and have been able to move a lot of their activities online and offer their services online and remotely. That's something I've been very privileged in myself. So in my role currently, we are able to operate mostly remotely. We primarily run events, so we've managed to move most of these events online, and most of the services we offer to our members online. Other industries haven't been so lucky. Similar to what you'd mentioned there has been schemes. A furlough scheme was enacted by the UK last year, and that sees the government pay up to 85% of an employee's wages if they're furloughed. There are some criteria you need to meet if you're on furlough. You're not allowed to work at all for the company while you're furloughed for them, because the government is obviously subsidising that. But there isn't any restrictions regarding layoffs, unfortunately. So although businesses do have the option to furlough their staff, we have still seen unemployment rise quite considerably, and there is no restriction in regarding the layoff of staff. That's still something that can happen under the current restrictions. As I'd mentioned, the furlough scheme, you'd mentioned there that you're expecting large layoffs, around 1 million coming up, and I think the UK is on track for something similar. This is something I can go into detail a little later. The furlough scheme, as it stands, is currently due to end on the 30th of April as of recording this. And the CBILS loans and the loan schemes that the government has offered are due to be repaid back this summer, the summer of 2020. So that's another expense businesses are going to have to consider moving forward. So overall, I think the impact has been hard on the UK, but it really depends on the industry. And I think, as I've mentioned, remote working has lessened the impact in certain industries that were able to move online. But unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the case across the board.
Yeah, I mean, all those companies who were able to move online, obviously, have reduced the impact of the 2020 pandemic. But unfortunately, not all companies were able to do so. Maybe also because their nature. So I mean, not all companies were able to do so. I mean, yeah, but yeah, coming to the final question, and then I would like to ask you something more. So a question we hadn't planned, but my final question would be, you talked about a scheme, approved by the government. What else do you think the government should do or would do to have the economy to go back to how it was? I mean, a couple of years ago. So one of the richest economies in the world. I'm talking about obviously the UK economy. So what could help the UK economy right now and in the in the next month? So I'm also having a look at the to next summer. So when hopefully the pandemic will be over, what should the government do to help your economy?
So it's quite a difficult question in a way, and quite a simple answer, but not a simple answer. If I go back to what I started with, the UK economy saw around a 19% decrease in GDP last year in March of 2020 over the first lockdown. However, we then lessened lockdown restrictions around, I think, May time. So that initial lockdown lasted around 6 or 7 weeks, I believe. Once those restrictions were lifted, industry started to open back up, and we saw GDP in the UK rise by around 16%, which, I'm by no means an economist, but to me that says, recovery is absolutely possible, and it happened relatively quickly in that initial period. And there was government schemes to help that as well. But, I think when we're looking now, the reason we saw the recovery happen so quickly back then was because businesses were in a much stronger position than they are now. So back in March of 2020, they'd only been in lockdown for around 6 weeks. whereas we're now approaching around 10 months. So the situation now is quite different. But ultimately, what the evidence has shown is the best way, and really the only way I can foresee for these industries to recover like they were before, is to open them back up. However, I by no means want to be spreading any anti-lockdown sentiment here. I think we can't open these industries until it's safe to do so, right? That has to be paramount here. Lives kind of have to trump the economy with respect to that. So although these industries have struggled, the best way for them to recover is opening them. We can't open them yet because it's not safe. I think, therefore, the best way for us to get into a position where it's safe to do that is to really focus on the vaccine rollout. And although there's been a lot of mistakes made by the government, I think it's fair to say one thing the UK government has been doing rather well is the vaccine rollout. I think we've got one of the highest vaccination rates in proportion to the population throughout Europe. And if the vaccine is effective in reducing the case rates and reducing the infection rates, and making it safer for people to meet in larger groups, I think we could then see these industries start to open back up, which would then help in recovery. I think that's the best way, or the best way these industries have in recovering. There are a couple of barriers to that, as I'd mentioned. So the furlough scheme ending, I imagine we're going to see quite a large spike in unemployment. A quick statistic here, as of December of last year, of 2020, around 9 million people were on the furlough scheme in the UK, which is around a tenth of the population almost, if we look at a population of around 60 million people overall.
Yeah.
As these companies are no longer able to hold on to their staff when the furlough scheme ends, I think we're going to see quite a spike in unemployment there. And as I said, when these loans begin to be repaid back during the summer, I think that, again, as that's another expense businesses have to consider, that might be another kind of barrier to recovery, so to speak. Another factor to consider that isn't really coronavirus related, but nonetheless will have an impact on employment, is Brexit.
Right, so you anticipated me. This is the question I would have liked to ask you. So regarding Brexit, which is something I somehow forgot to ask you, but we should take into account this thing as well. So Brexit, pandemic and Brexit. So let me just ask you this question, then you can go on. Obviously, the two labour markets will no longer, cooperate as they used to do. Yeah. So some human resources, some human capital used to travel to the UK, and by that I mean scholars, skilled workers, and so on. And some UK skilled workers and scholars used to travel to Europe and work there. So how do you think the job market will be affected by the Brexit as well, in this general situation of pandemic as well? So, and sorry for interrupting you, but that was exactly the question I wanted to ask you a couple of minutes ago.
Yes, I believe. Well, I don't believe we're going to fully see the effects of Brexit and employment just now in the pandemic. Obviously, there has been effects already. Quite a lot to list, but there has definitely been an impact. However, regarding employment, I don't think we necessarily have the full picture of that yet, because so many people are unemployed, because the job market is the way it is, and so many people are on furlough. And given the situation currently, I don't think we've actually seen the impacts of Brexit on employment, because it's almost been clouded by everything happening just now. I think the picture will start to become clearer as we move on from the pandemic. I think we're all hopeful that coronavirus will one day be a thing of the past. It's not going to be permanent. It is something that we are going to get over, and it is something we're going to beat. Brexit is considerably different. It's permanent, so the effects of that aren't necessarily going to go away. But I don't think that's something we're going to really see the impact of just now. I think we're going to need to wait until we've kind of got over the pandemic and the economy has recovered and employment has returned to some form of normality before we then see how international travel and things have impacted that. Because bearing in mind, just now in the UK, I believe there's currently travel bans on a lot of countries, and like mandated quarantines for incoming travellers and outgoing travellers. And even within the UK, I know for Scotland specifically, I can't speak in details for England, but I know in Scotland, we're not currently allowed to leave our own council areas. So even, regardless of international travel, employees can't really move within council areas within Scotland unless it's an absolutely essential necessity to do so. So, yeah, just to sum up there, I don't think we've seen the effects of Brexit and employment yet, but I think that's something that will become more evident and more clear as the effects of the pandemic lessen and we get over the pandemic. And to circle back to what I was saying, really, I think if we can, that the best way to recover as a service-based economy is to open things up when it is safe to do so, when the vaccine has been rolled out, when the case numbers are low, infections are low, and when it's safe for people to finally meet again. I think that's the only real way we'll see economic recovery in these industries. Another interesting thing to just explore there really quickly is remote working and how remote working is going to help aid this recovery. I think it's interesting to think, had this pandemic hit 20, even 30 years ago, I think unemployment would have been far, far higher. I think a lot of industries wouldn't have been able to adapt nearly as well as they have now because we're now able to work remotely and work online. And I wonder if going forward, that might be something that circumvents some of the effects of Brexit, right? So given that there's no more free movement between the UK and the EU, that there's therefore no more free movement of employees, because so many industries have now had to adapt so quickly to online working and it's become the norm for many industries now, I wonder if we'll then still see, more cooperation than perhaps we would have expected because employees can now work for international organisations and vice versa online, and then you don't have to consider things like visas or resident status or citizenship or passports or anything like that. That can be done purely remotely. You'll know better than me. I don't know how payment would work in these situations. I don't know if the law is stopping that there, but I imagine it would, like I said, circumvent some of the effects Brexit has had, and indeed some of the effects coronavirus has had. I think even just now, a lot of employees are finding they can now apply for jobs that previously maybe wouldn't have been open to them because of the distance involved, because of having to commute. Whereas you can now work for companies all over the UK online, which was a possibility before, but it wasn't something that was ever taken seriously. It's not something the job market has ever really considered en masse until it had to adapt with the pandemic. So I think remote working could improve the recovery and change how the recovery is. It's kind of looked at and how we progress with it.
Yeah, there's this chance this chance we have to work online. So that's what you call and that's your language. So you are right. You are right when you call it home working. In Italy, I don't know why we call it smart working. I don't think there's a particular reason, but we all needed to adapt to this situation. But most of all, we need to keep this faith that sooner or later we have the chance to recover. So this is what I noticed while you were speaking, that you have this strong belief that when it be the case. So I think in 3 months, maybe, we don't know it at the moment, but sooner or later we have the chance, and we'll need to recover. So obviously when it be safe for everybody, but we need to to do everything we can to restart, in a few words. So thank you, David, for accepting once again my invitation, for your time, for the time you spent with us, you dedicated to this interview. It's been a pleasure. Obviously, we'll be in touch as usual on LinkedIn, and so we'll probably have more chats. I'll post this interview on LinkedIn and on Kepler HR, which is the website I founded a couple of months ago. There you find on keplerhr.com, you find many more contents about human resources, human capital, and the job market. You'll find Italian and English contents, and among them, there's interview as well. David, chat soon. Thank you for your time.
Of course, thank you for having me.
And I wish everybody a good afternoon, and chat soon. Thank you.